Imagine a Middle East where the U.S., not France, held the mandate for Syria, and a unified Arab state, not Israel-controlled Palestine. That's the world the King Crane Commission envisioned. Back in 1919, today we're deep diving into America's Forgotten Middle East initiative, the King Crane Commission of 1919, and the Commission's own confidential report. It's a behind-the-scenes look at history in the making, revealing how public opinion really factored into post-World War I decisions.
Whether you're a history buff,
Or just curious about how the modern Middle East came to be.
this deep dive will challenge some assumptions.
For sure.
What makes this period so fascinating is the backdrop.
Okay.
You have the Ottoman Empire collapsing after World War I, European powers like Britain and France
Right.
ready to swoop in and divide the spoils, each with their own agendas.
It's a total free-for-all.
Exactly.
And then you have Woodrow Wilson,
Yes.
the U.S. president at the time,
Yeah.
championing this idea of self-determination,
Right.
people choosing their own government.
Ah.
Sounds great on
That
paper.
sounds great.
But how do you apply that in such a complex, volatile region?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's precisely why Wilson sent the King Crane Commission.
Okay.
They were tasked with going into the former Ottoman territories
Hmm.
and actually asking the people what they wanted for their future
Mm-hmm.
before any final decisions were made at the Paris Peace Conference.
Their methodology for gathering those opinions was really
It
interesting.
was fascinating.
It wasn't just a quick survey or a few town hall meetings.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
They held meetings with delegations representing all the major groups
Oh, wow.
in each community,
Okay.
trying to be as inclusive as possible. This approach actually aligned with a tradition in the region called Masbata, where local notables would petition the government on various issues.
Right.
So it wasn't entirely alien to the people they were interviewing.
Wow, I never considered the impact of local customs on their approach. So they're on the ground hearing from everyday people. What kind of picture starts to emerge?
One of the most striking findings was the overwhelming desire for a unified and independent Syria, and that included Palestine. They wanted to be one Arab state, free from any foreign control.
But didn't the European powers have other plans?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
France, in particular, was keen on controlling Syria,
Okay.
but the Commission heard strong opposition to any French involvement.
Why is that?
It was a mix of things.
Okay.
Perceived religious bias, the people saw France as a Catholic power
Right.
that wouldn't respect their predominantly Muslim culture.
Uh-huh.
Then there was the fear of colonization,
Right.
a very real concern, given France's history in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And let's not forget,
Yeah.
this was all happening in the wake of a brutal world war.
Right.
People were exhausted
Uh,
and wary of further foreign intervention.
that makes sense.
Yes.
So France was a hard no.
Yeah.
What about Britain? They were a major player in the region, too.
The views on Britain were more complicated.
Okay.
Some groups, particularly those aligned with Emir Faisal,
Okay.
a prominent Arab leader supported by the British,
Oh.
appreciated their backing. But others saw British involvement as ultimately self-serving, just another form of imperialism dressed up in different clothes.
So you have this mix of hope and skepticism towards Britain.
Exactly.
What about the idea of a Zionist state in Palestine? Was that something people supported?
Not at all. There was widespread rejection of the Zionist program,
Okay.
with a clear distinction made between long-resident Jews and newly arriving Zionist Jews, who were seen as a potential threat. It's important to note that this opposition wasn't necessarily about anti-Semitism. It was a complex reaction to a specific political movement that was seen as potentially displacing existing populations.
That's a really crucial distinction.
It is.
It seems the commission was walking a tightrope, trying to balance these competing desires
Yes.
and understand the nuances of each group's aspirations.
Absolutely. And before they even left Paris for the Middle East, they started hearing conflicting viewpoints from experts. They spoke with people like Henry Morgenthau, the former U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He actually suggested dividing the empire into zones,
Really?
controlled by the U.S., Britain, and France.
Wow.
And they heard from William Westerman,
Okay.
an academic who was part of a group called the Inquiry.
I remember reading about that. Wasn't that a think tank tasked with coming up with plans for the post-war world?
Yes, precisely.
Okay.
They were essentially trying to map out a new world order.
Hmm.
Interestingly, Westerman's suggestions were quite similar to Morgenthau's. He also favored mandates,
What's that?
which essentially meant Western powers would oversee these newly formed nations.
Okay.
And even at this early stage, the Commission started hearing concerns about a potential Zionist state in Palestine foreshadowing the conflicts that would arise later.
So even before they hit the ground, the
Yes,
commission was already grappling with the complexities of this situation.
absolutely.
They traveled extensively, gathering testimony from various sources. I'm curious, what did they do when they couldn't physically get to a region?
Their trip to Istanbul provides a great example of that. They were eager to travel throughout Anatolia,
Okay.
but ongoing unrest and political complexities made it impossible.
So how did they gather information?
They relied heavily on delegations and representatives who came to Istanbul to
Oh.
voice their concerns and aspirations. For example, they heard from Armenians who desperately desired an independent state,
Yeah, okay.
acknowledging the challenges they face as a minority in many areas.
So they were still able to get a sense of the diversity of opinions in Anatolia, even without traveling there themselves?
Yes.
Did they hear from any other groups?
They also heard from Kurds who were seeking autonomy,
Okay.
which highlighted potential conflicts, not only with Turkish authorities, but also with Armenian aspirations.
Uh-huh.
And of course, there were the Greeks,
Right.
who had a wide range of opinions,
Huh.
with some advocating for Greek control of certain Turkish coastal areas.
It's amazing how much complexity they uncovered, even with these limitations.
It really highlights their commitment to understanding the situation from multiple perspectives, even when faced with logistical and political obstacles. And remember, they were doing all of this against the backdrop of the Paris Peace Conference, where the major powers were already starting to carve up the Ottoman Empire amongst themselves.
It sounds like the commission was in a race against time,
Yes.
trying to understand the situation on the ground before those decisions were finalized.
Right.
So after all this travel and testimony,
Yeah.
what did they actually recommend?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Their recommendations were bold, and they directly challenged the ambitions of the European powers. Their top recommendation was a unified, independent Syria, including Palestine, under a single mandate. And get this, they wanted the U.S. to be the mandatory power.
Wow.
Think of a mandate as a temporary guardianship, where a powerful country oversees a newly formed nation, helping it get on its feet.
Okay.
They saw America as the most impartial choice, believing it wouldn't try to exploit the region for its own gain.
That's a pretty radical departure from what the European powers had in mind.
It was. They listed Britain as a second choice if the U.S. refused.
Right.
But the idea of a French mandate was completely off the table, both for the Commission and the people they'd interviewed.
So unified Syria under American or British oversight?
Correct.
What else did they recommend?
They suggested separate mandates for Turkey and Armenia,
Okay.
ideally with U.S. oversight there as well.
Okay.
And recognizing the strategic importance of Constantinople, now Istanbul, they proposed some form of international control
Oh.
to prevent future conflicts over the Turkish Straits.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, whoever controls that has a lot of power.
Exactly. It was a geopolitical hot potato. And the Commission was trying to find a solution that wouldn't simply hand over control to one of the major powers,
Yeah.
potentially sparking future conflicts.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, we've talked about the widespread opposition to a Zionist state in Palestine. How did that factor into their recommendations?
Their findings on that issue were probably the most controversial.
Okay.
They recommended a significantly scaled-back Zionist program,
Really?
mainly because of the overwhelming local opposition they'd encountered. They saw a large-scale Jewish state as a violation of the principle of self-determination.
So majority rule was a key factor in their thinking. But didn't they also grapple with the complexities of that? How do you balance the will of the majority with the need to protect minority rights?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something the Commission recognized.
Okay.
They understood that sometimes purely following the will of the majority might lead to injustices
Right.
or even new forms of oppression.
Yeah.
They acknowledged that certain situations like protecting the rights of minorities might require solutions
Yeah.
that go beyond a simple majority vote.
So they were aware of the potential pitfalls of a purely majoritarian approach.
Yes.
Did they give any specific examples of how they might handle such situations?
They pointed to the Maronites in Lebanon, a Christian group within a largely Muslim population.
Okay.
They recognized that even within a unified Syria,
Right.
such groups might need special consideration to ensure their rights were protected. They also recognized that strategic considerations, like the control of the Turkish Straits, might necessitate solutions that don't perfectly reflect the demographics of a particular region.
It sounds like they were trying to find a balance between respecting the will of the people
Yes.
and acknowledging the complexities of a region with such diverse groups
Hmm.
and competing interests. Did they address how they'd ensure those minority rights were protected?
They emphasize the importance of a strong secular government
Okay.
that would treat all citizens equally regardless of their religion or ethnicity. They believed that education was key to fostering tolerance and understanding between different groups.
It seems like they were putting a lot of faith in the power of education to overcome these deeply rooted divisions.
They were. And it's worth noting that their views on this were shaped by their own experiences in the United States.
Mhm.
They saw the diversity of religious sects in America as evidence that pluralism could work. And they believed that education was crucial to making that possible.
It's interesting how their own cultural background influenced their thinking. But didn't they also have differing opinions among themselves about how to approach this issue of modernity and governance in the Middle East?
They absolutely did. Remember those contrasting views on Islam we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
King Crane and Lieber, for example, seemed more optimistic about Islam's ability to coexist with a secular government. They saw signs of modernity within Islamic societies and believed that Islam could adapt to a Western model of governance.
But Montgomery and Yale were much more skeptical, right?
Yes, they feared that Muslim rule would inevitably lead to the oppression of minorities. They saw Zionism, with its emphasis on Western values and secular governance, as a better path to achieving modernity and stability in the region.
So you have this fundamental disagreement about the nature of Islam and
Eh.
its compatibility with Western-style democracy. It sounds like this internal debate within the commission reflects a broader tension between respecting the desires of local populations and imposing a preconceived notion of what progress looks like.
That's a very astute observation, and it gets to the heart of the dilemma the Commission was facing. They were tasked with implementing Wilson's vision of self-determination, which emphasized respecting the will of the people. But they were also operating within a framework that assumed Western models of governance were superior, more modern, more progressive. It's a contradiction that runs throughout their entire report.
It's a tension that's played out repeatedly throughout history, hasn't it? The clash between respecting local cultures and imposing outside models of development and progress. And it's a tension that continues to shape global politics even today.
Absolutely. And in the case of the King-Crane Commission, this tension ultimately undermined their efforts. Their recommendations, despite their good intentions and their meticulous methodology, were ignored by the major powers.
That's incredibly disheartening. They went to such lengths to understand the desires of the people in the region only to be completely disregarded. It makes you wonder, what was the point of the whole exercise, if their findings were going to be ignored?
It's a valid question, and one that historians continue to debate.
Right.
Some argue that the Commission was doomed from the start, that their mission was a naive attempt to apply idealistic principles to a world driven by realpolitik. Others see the Commission's work as a valuable, albeit flawed, attempt to understand the complexities of the Middle East and to advocate for a more just and equitable post-war order.
I suppose it depends on how you define success. Even if their recommendations weren't implemented, their report provides a fascinating glimpse into a pivotal moment in history.
I agree.
It reveals the aspirations of the people in the region,
Yes.
the competing visions for the future,
Yeah.
and the challenges of implementing self-determination in a world shaped by power politics.
Exactly. And it raises important questions about the role of public opinion in international decision-making. Questions that are just as relevant today as they were back in 1919.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that history is filled with these what-if moments,
Right.
turning points where different choices could have led to very different outcomes.
It makes you wonder how the Middle East might look today if the King Crane recommendations had been followed. Would it have been a more peaceful, stable region, or would different conflicts have arisen?
It's impossible to know for sure, but it's a question worth pondering as we delve deeper into the specific arguments and observations that shapes the Commission's final report.
Let's dive into those specific arguments. We already talked about anxieties surrounding land ownership and the potential displacement of Arab populations if a large-scale Zionist state were established.
Right. And those anxieties were amplified by the fact that many saw the Zionist movement as an extension of European colonialism, just another way for Western powers to exert control over the region.
Given the history of colonialism in other parts of the world, those fears are understandable. Were there any other concerns the Commission noted?
They heard a lot of anxieties regarding the holy sites in the region. Many people argued that Jews would not be reliable custodians of places sacred to Muslims and Christians.
Hmm. That raises the question of how you'd even manage such a situation. Who gets to decide what happens to these holy places in a region with so much religious diversity?
It's a question that remains contentious to this day, and it highlights the immense challenges the Commission was facing, trying to come up with solutions that would respect the rights and beliefs of all these different groups.
It wasn't just about practical concerns like land ownership and access to holy sites. Didn't they also hear arguments challenging the historical basis for Zionist claims to the land?
Yes, some argued that an occupation from 2,000 years ago wasn't a legitimate basis for claiming the land in the present day. They pointed to the continuous presence of Arab populations in the region as evidence that Jewish historical claims were no longer valid.
So we're seeing a mix of practical, religious, and historical arguments all converging on this issue of Zionism. It sounds like the Commission had a lot to consider as they weighed these different perspectives.
They did.
Right.
And it's important to remember that they weren't a monolithic group.
Right.
Each commissioner brought their own background experiences and biases to the table, and those individual perspectives shaped how they interpreted the information they were gathering.
We talked about Lieber being initially sympathetic to Zionism, but then being swayed by his interactions with the Arab population. What about the other commissioners? How did their views differ?
King, for example, was deeply troubled by the methods employed by the Zionists to achieve their goals.
Oh.
He felt they were manipulating the situation, using their influence and connections to secure land and political support. And he believed that this approach would ultimately be harmful to the long-term peace of the region. He was very critical of the Balfour Declaration, the British statement that expressed support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
So while Lieber was moved by the aspirations of the Arab population, King was more focused on the methods and potential consequences of the Zionist movement itself. What about Montgomery? He seemed to be the most supportive of Zionism.
Yes, Montgomery believed that a Zionist state would bring modernity and progress to the region.
Okay.
He saw it as a potential counterweight to what he perceived as the threat of pan-Islamism, a movement that advocated for the political unity of Muslims worldwide.
Oh.
He believed that a Western-aligned state in the heart of the Middle East would be beneficial for both the region and Western interests.
So we have this fascinating clash of ideologies within the Commission itself. It's not just a debate about Zionism,
Right.
but about broader visions for the future of the Middle East, about what progress looks like and who gets to define it.
Precisely. And those ideological debates were further complicated by the geopolitical interests of the major powers involved. Remember, this was all happening in the wake of a world war that had reshaped the global power landscape.
Absolutely. We've talked about French ambitions in Syria and British concerns about securing their route to India. But what were some of the other geopolitical factors that the Commission had to navigate?
Well, as we've already discussed, the question of what to do with Constantinople and the Turkish Straits was a major issue.
Yeah.
It was a strategically vital region,
Yeah.
and the Commission had to balance the desire for self-determination with the need to ensure stability and prevent future conflicts. They ultimately recommended some form of international control, a solution that aimed to satisfy both local aspirations and global security concerns.
That makes sense given the importance of those straits for trade and military access. It sounds like they were really trying to find creative solutions to these incredibly complex problems.
They were. And their report is filled with these fascinating glimpses into the political maneuvering and power dynamics of the time. For example, they noted how French soldiers tried to hinder individuals and groups from reaching them, attempting to control the narrative and limit the perspectives the Commission was exposed to.
It's a reminder that they weren't operating in a vacuum. Their work was happening amidst this complex web of competing interests and agendas, both within the region and on the global stage. Did this impact the responses they received?
Absolutely. Despite those attempts to influence them, one thing that comes through clearly in the report is the widespread admiration for America and its ideals. Many people expressed their hope that the U.S. would play a leading role in the region, see America as a beacon of democracy and a potential counterbalance to European imperialism.
They saw America as a force for good in the world,
Yes,
a country that could help them achieve their own aspirations for freedom and self-government.
they did. And they often contrasted America favorably with the European powers, particularly France. They saw America as less imperialistic, more genuinely committed to the principles of self-determination. One Syrian leader even said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that they preferred America because it wasn't driven by greed for colonies like the other powers.
It's a powerful statement, and it reflects the complex relationship between the West and the Middle East that continues to this day. But amidst all this hope and idealism, They were also quite vocal about their fears, weren't they?
They were,
Mm.
especially when it came to the prospect of French control. They saw the French as culturally different, religiously biased, and ultimately intent on colonizing them. There's a chilling passage in the report where the Commission describes witnessing French soldiers hindering the attempts of individuals and groups to reach the Commission, essentially trying to control the narrative and limit the perspectives the Commission was exposed to.
It's a reminder that the Commission wasn't operating in a vacuum. Their work was happening amidst a complex power struggle, and they weren't always able to get an unbiased view of the situation.
Right. And despite the challenges, they still managed to gather an incredible amount of information and provide a truly unique perspective on this pivotal moment in history.
So we've uncovered the Commission's methodology, their findings, their recommendations, the competing viewpoints they encountered, and even their own internal disagreements. But there's one more layer we need to explore, and it's perhaps the most revealing of all: the underlying beliefs about modernity that shaped their interpretations.
Remember that liberal developmentalism we talked about earlier? The idea that all societies progress along a linear path from traditional to modern.
Yeah, with America, of course, being the shining example of what modern looks like.
Right. And that framework, whether they were fully conscious of it or not, influenced how the Commission interpreted what they saw and heard. It's evident in the language they used to describe different groups, and it played a role in their judgments about who was ready for self-government.
It's like they were looking at these diverse cultures through a very specific lens.
Exactly. And that lens distorted their perceptions in some crucial ways. For example, they were fascinated by what they perceived as signs of modernity within Islam, seeing it as evidence that Muslims could adapt to a Western model of governance. They pointed to examples like women attending religious instruction or a prominent Muslim woman speaking out in public as signs of progress.
Which, from our perspective today, seems incredibly simplistic and even a bit condescending.
It is. It's imposing a very specific set of values on a culture that might have a completely different understanding of things like gender roles, religious practice, and social change. Yeah. And it's assuming that progress always looks the same regardless of the cultural context.
Which, as we know from history, just isn't true. Cultures can evolve in many different ways, and what looks like progress to one group might be seen as a step backward by another.
Exactly. And the Commission's preconceived notions about modernity also shaped their views on the capacity of different groups for tolerance and pluralism. Their belief that Islam could adapt to a modern secular government was a key factor in their support for a unified, independent Syria. They believed that Muslims and Christians could coexist peacefully, and that a strong secular government could ensure the protection of minority rights. Of course, not all the commissioners shared this optimistic view, as we've discussed. Montgomery and Yale in particular were much more skeptical about the prospects for tolerance and pluralism under Muslim rule.
It seems like their own internal debate reflects a broader tension that was playing out on the world stage at that time. The tension between respecting the right of self-determination and imposing a particular vision of what a modern society should look like.
That's an excellent point. And that tension, that unresolved contradiction, is at the heart of why the King-Crane Commission's recommendations, despite their good intentions and their meticulous efforts, ultimately failed to make a real impact. They were caught between the ideal of respecting the will of the people and the belief that certain cultures needed to be guided towards a specific predefined outcome.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it? A reminder that even the most well-intentioned efforts can be undermined by unexamined biases and a failure to truly understand the nuances of the context in which we're operating.
Absolutely. And the legacy of the King-Crane Commission is a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's a testament to the importance of listening to the voices of the people, of trying to understand their desires and aspirations, and of acknowledging the complexities of a situation before imposing solutions from the outside.
It provides a valuable historical record of a pivotal moment, a snapshot of the diverse perspectives that existed at the time.
Right. But it's also a reminder of the limitations of our own perspectives, of the dangers of imposing our own values and beliefs on others, and of the enduring challenges of reconciling the ideals of self-determination with the realities of power politics.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the King-Crane Commission, we leave you with this thought. In a world increasingly shaped by globalization and interconnectedness, how can we ensure that the voices of all people are heard and respected? How can we approach complex situations with humility and a willingness to learn from those who are different from us? It's a question that's just as relevant today as it was back in 1919, a question that each of us must grapple with as we navigate our own increasingly complex world.